The rain had not stopped since dawn, yet the crowd still gathered around the wooden platform, umbrellas dripping, boots sinking into mud. A widow stood barefoot above them all, her baby hidden beneath her shawl, refusing the cold. The auctioneer read her debts aloud like a list of sins, and men bid on her hand as though she were a plot of land or a prized mare. She kept her chin lifted. She would not let them see her break. A carriage burst through the crowd, splitting the onlookers apart. It did not stop at the edge like the others. It rolled straight up to the platform steps, mud splattering across polished boots as a man jumped down before the wheels even settled. He wore no hat, his coat soaked through, his breathing heavy from a ride that had clearly been reckless. The auctioneer called for silence and prepared another number. The man climbed the steps 2 at a time, stood beside the widow, and turned to face the crowd. He said only 3 words. "I'll take them." The crowd erupted into whispers, some in disbelief, others already spreading rumors about who this duke was and why he'd risk his name for a stranger and her child. "Tell me something. If you saw a duke abandon his own plans to rescue a widow he'd never met, what would you assume was his real reason? Type your guess below, and let me know which city or town you're watching from tonight. I'll check the comments myself. Subscribe if you want to see how far this goes. The rain had not stopped since dawn, and by midday it had turned the market square into a swamp of mud and misery, the kind of relentless downpour that seemed to seep into every seam of clothing and every corner of hope. Widow Margaret Thornberry stood barefoot on the wooden platform, her baby daughter wrapped tight beneath a worn shawl, her arms trembling from holding the weight for so long without rest. 3 months had passed since her husband's death, and the debts he left behind had swallowed everything they once owned. The house was gone, taken by men who did not look her in the eye when they nailed the notice to the door. The furniture was sold at half its worth to buyers who haggled over her grief like it meant nothing at all. Even the small garden her husband had once tended with quiet pride had been stripped bare by neighbors eager to claim whatever value remained before the collectors arrived to seal the property entirely. Now the collectors had decided that she herself would be used to settle what remained of a debt she barely understood. Around her, the market carried on with its usual noise, vendors calling out prices for bread and wool, children darting between carts despite the rain, dogs barking at the edges of the crowd. Yet all of it seemed to fade into a dull hum beneath the sharper sound of the auctioneer's voice, cutting through the wet morning air like a whip cracking against canvas. He read out her worth as though she were livestock brought in from a pasture, mentioning her age, her health, her ability to work long hours, and the unfortunate fact that she came with an infant who would need years of feeding before she could earn her own keep. The crowd murmured at this, some clicking their tongues in judgment, others leaning forward with an interest sharper than pity, hungry for the spectacle of another person's ruin laid bare before them. A merchant standing near the front, his coat a patchwork of mismatched fabrics stitched together from years of frugal mending, raised his hand and called out a low number, testing how desperate the crowd truly was to see her sold. Margaret did not look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on the grey horizon beyond the rooftops, counting the beats of her own heart just to keep herself upright, focusing on the distant church spire barely visible through the haze of rain. Anything to keep her mind from the humiliation pressing down upon her shoulders like a physical weight. Her feet had gone numb from standing in the cold mud, and her arms ached from holding her daughter so tightly. But she refused to let her knees buckle in front of these strangers who had gathered as though this were nothing more than an afternoon's entertainment. Her daughter, barely 4 months old, stirred faintly beneath the shawl but didn't cry. It was as though even the child understood that tears now would only invite more cruelty, more curious eyes, more danger lurking beneath the surface of every stranger's glance. Margaret pressed her lips gently against the baby's forehead, whispering words meant only for the two of them, promises she was not certain she could keep, though she meant every one of them with the whole of her breaking heart. Another man shouted a higher number from somewhere near the back, his voice thick with drink, drawing a ripple of laughter from those standing closest to him. Then another voice rose above the murmur, offering even more. A landowner Margaret vaguely recognized from church gatherings years ago, back when her husband was alive, and her life had shape and safety, and a future that did not involve standing barefoot in mud while strangers priced her like cattle. The auctioneer's hammer hovered above the block, ready to fall the moment silence returned, sealing her fate to whichever man offered the highest sum for a widow desperate enough to be sold like property in the middle of a town square, in full view of neighbors who had once shared bread with her family at harvest gatherings. A woman near the edge of the crowd turned away, unable to watch further, pulling her own children close as though the sight might somehow spread to them like sickness. An older man muttered something about the shame of it, though he did nothing beyond shaking his head before returning his attention to his own errands. Margaret noticed these small reactions distantly, as though watching from far outside her own body, some part of her already retreating inward to survive what she could not prevent. That was when the sound of hooves thundered from the road leading into town, cutting through the noise of the crowd like a crack of thunder, splitting open the sky. A black carriage, pulled by two horses soaked to their bones and breathing hard from a punishing pace, tore through the gathering without slowing. People scattered in every direction, shouting curses and pulling children out of the mud. But the driver atop the carriage didn't care. He drove as though the entire world had narrowed down to reaching this square before it was too late, his hands white against the reins, his hat long since lost somewhere along the road behind him. The carriage screeched to a halt just beside the platform, mud spraying high across the boots of those standing closest to the wheels, some stumbling backward in surprise at the suddenness of it. The door swung open before the wheels had even finished settling into the mud. A man stepped down, his coat drenched through to the lining, his boots sinking instantly into the ground beneath him. He did not pause to straighten his collar or wipe the rain from his face, though droplets ran freely down his jaw and into the collar of his shirt. He moved with the urgency of a man who had ridden through the storm without rest, without stopping even to change horses, driven by something the crowd could not yet understand, something that had clearly consumed every thought since the moment he first heard word of what was happening in this square. The crowd turned as one to look at him, whispers spreading fast through the wet air, passed from mouth to mouth, faster than the rain itself could fall. Some recognized the crest stitched faintly into the shoulder of his coat, a symbol belonging to one of the oldest titles in the region, worn thin from years of use, but unmistakable to those who knew its shape. Others simply saw the way he carried himself, tall, commanding, utterly unwilling to be ignored even by men twice his age who had spent their whole lives believing themselves untouchable within the boundaries of this town. He climbed the steps of the platform two at a time, his boots striking the wood hard enough to silence the nearest onlookers, the sound sharp and deliberate against the murmur of the crowd. The auctioneer opened his mouth to protest the interruption, already forming words about proper procedure and the sanctity of the sale, about bids already placed and obligations already made. But the look on the newcomer's face silenced him before a single syllable escaped his throat. "I'll take them," the man said. His voice was steady, though his chest still heaved from the ride, each word landing heavy in the wet air, like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward through the crowd until even the furthest onlookers had gone quiet to hear what would happen next. Silence swept over the square, broken only by the sound of rain striking wood and mud, and the distant nervous shuffle of horses still catching their breath. Margaret turned to look at him for the first time, confusion and disbelief written plainly across her face. She did not know this man. She had never seen him before in her life, not at church, not at market, not among the faces that had once populated her husband's small circle of acquaintances during better years. "Your Grace," the auctioneer stammered, recognition dawning across his face, as though he had just realized the danger of delaying a man of such standing any further. "This is highly unusual. The lot has not yet been finalized. There are other bids on the table, gentlemen who have offered fairly and in good faith." "Then finalize it now," the man said, reaching into his coat and producing a leather pouch heavy with coin, the weight of it evident in the way it pulled at his hand and struck the auctioneer's palm with a solid, undeniable sound. He tossed it toward the auctioneer without a moment's hesitation, without even glancing to see if it landed safely. "That should cover whatever debt remains, and considerably more besides, enough that no man here should feel cheated of his morning." The crowd erupted into a wave of murmurs and shock, voices rising and falling like a tide pulling back from shore. Men who had been shouting bids only moments earlier stepped back into the safety of the crowd, unwilling to challenge a duke over a widow they barely knew and cared for even less. Once real money had entered the matter. The landowner who had offered the highest sum lowered his hand slowly, his face reddening with a mixture of embarrassment and quiet resentment, though he said nothing further, wisely choosing silence over confrontation. Margaret's knees weakened beneath her, but she forced herself to remain standing, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of watching her collapse after everything she had already endured that morning. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the steady rain drumming against the wooden platform beneath their feet. "Why would you do this? You do not know me. You do not know my child." He looked at her then, his gaze steady despite the water dripping steadily from his hair and down the sharp line of his jaw, his expression carrying none of the pity she had expected, only something quieter and harder to name. "Because no woman deserves to be sold on a platform like cattle brought in from the fields, and no child deserves to grow up hearing that her mother was auctioned to strangers in the middle of a market square, in front of people who once called her family neighbor." The man's name, as Margaret would soon learn, was Duke Barnaby Ashcombe, though few among the crowd that day had ever seen him this close or heard him speak more than a passing greeting exchanged at some distant social gathering. He was known mostly through rumors that traveled faster than fact, whispers of a duke who kept to himself behind the walls of his estate, who avoided balls and social gatherings that other men of his rank attended eagerly, and who managed his lands and his household with a discipline so strict it unsettled even the servants who had known him since childhood, and had watched him grow from a solemn boy into an even more solemn man. He extended his hand toward Margaret, offering to help her down from the platform, but she hesitated, clutching her daughter tighter against her chest, as though the gesture itself might be some trick, some cruelty dressed up as kindness before a different sort of humiliation revealed itself. The crowd around them had begun to disperse slowly, though many lingered at a distance, watching with open curiosity as the scene continued to unfold before them. "I am not here to harm you," he said, his voice softer now than it had been moments earlier when he addressed the auctioneer with such an unwavering command. "I only ask that you come with me. away from this rain and these people, so that we might speak properly, away from prying eyes and eager ears that have already seen more of your misfortune than any person deserves in a single morning. Margaret glanced around at the crowd, at the auctioneer counting his coins with trembling hands, at the men who had been bidding on her only minutes before, their expressions now a mixture of disappointment and quiet relief that they had not been forced to actually pay such a sum for a woman and child they had never intended to care for, beyond the transaction itself. She realized, with a heaviness settling in her chest, that she had no other option left to her. Staying meant enduring further humiliation, further danger, perhaps another auction the following week, if this one somehow fell through or was later disputed. Leaving meant stepping into the unknown with a stranger who had just spent a fortune to save her and her child from a fate she could barely bring herself to think about, let alone describe aloud to anyone who might ask later. She took his hand. His grip was firm but careful, as though he understood without being told that she needed steadiness rather than force in that moment. He guided her down the platform steps slowly, allowing her time to find her footing in the mud, and did not release her hand until she stood safely beside the waiting carriage, her daughter still pressed protectively against her chest. The carriage ride away from the square was silent at first, filled only with the rhythmic sound of rain against the roof and the creak of wheels turning over uneven roads, the world outside blurring into streaks of grey and green as they left the town behind. Margaret sat across from him, her daughter now sleeping despite the rattling motion beneath them, exhausted from a morning of cold and fear that no infant should have had to endure. Margaret studied the Duke's face carefully in the dim light filtering through the carriage window, searching for some sign of what he truly wanted from her, some hint of the cruelty she had learned to expect from men of his position and wealth over the difficult months since her husband's passing. "You must have questions," he finally said, breaking the silence as the carriage rolled past fields blurred grey by the falling rain, hedgerows dripping steadily along the roadside. "I have many," she replied, her voice guarded, careful not to reveal too much of the fear still coiled tightly in her chest. The first being why a duke, a man with land and title and more wealth than most towns combined, would spend such a sum on a widow he has never once met in his life, a woman with nothing left to offer him in return. He looked out the window for a long moment, watching the countryside pass before answering, as though weighing how much of the truth he was prepared to share with a stranger he had known for less than an hour. "I received word this morning that an auction was taking place, a widow and her child being sold to cover a debt left behind by a husband who could no longer answer for it. I did not know your name when I gave the order to ready my carriage. I did not know your face. I only knew that I could not allow it to happen, not when I possessed the means to stop it, before it was too late for you both." "That is not truly an answer," Margaret said, her tone sharper than she intended, though she did not apologize for it, too exhausted to soften her words for the sake of politeness. "That is a reason born of guilt, not a reason born of choice, and I would rather understand which it truly is before I decide what to make of your kindness." His jaw tightened at her words, and for a brief moment she believed she had overstepped some invisible boundary between a duke and the woman he had just purchased from a crowd of strangers, a boundary she did not yet fully understand the shape of. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter, heavier, with something that sounded almost like old grief carried for years without ever being set down. "My mother was sold once, in a manner not entirely different from this one, though the circumstances were not identical in every detail. She was rescued by my father, a man very much like myself in temperament, though their story did not end as kindly as I hope yours will, for reasons I do not wish to burden you with on your very first day beneath my roof." Margaret said nothing in response, sensing the weight behind his words, the years of silence that must have surrounded whatever history he carried quietly within him. She had heard fragments of stories about noble families hiding tragic pasts behind polished manors and grand estates, whispered at church gatherings and market stalls. But she had never expected to find herself sitting across from a man carrying such a burden himself, let alone one who had just rescued her from the very fate his own mother once suffered decades before. The carriage continued rolling through the storm, past fields and hedgerows blurred by the relentless rain, until the outline of a grand estate finally appeared in the distance, its towers rising against the grey sky like something out of a story told to children at bedtime, half real and half imagined. Margaret's breath caught at the sight of it, towering stone walls stretching far wider than any building she had ever stood near, windows glowing faintly with candlelight, despite the gloom pressing down from above, smoke rising steadily from several chimneys against the darkened sky. "This is where you live?" she asked, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice as the carriage drew closer along the winding drive. "This is where you will live now," he corrected gently, though there was no command in his tone, only quiet certainty, the kind of statement made by a man unaccustomed to being questioned, but careful, nonetheless not to sound as though he expected obedience. "You and your daughter will want for nothing here, not shelter, not food, not safety, not for as long as you wish to remain." Margaret's grip on her daughter tightened instinctively at those words, old fears rising quickly to the surface, despite everything he had already done for her that morning. "I did not ask to be kept, Your Grace. I asked only to be saved from that platform, nothing more than that. And I would not wish to trade one form of dependence for another without fully understanding what is expected of me in return." "You have been saved," he said simply, meeting her gaze without flinching. "What happens beyond this moment is entirely your choice to make. I will not force you into anything you do not wish for, not now, not ever. And you are free to leave this house the moment you find another path forward, should you wish to take it." The carriage rolled to a slow stop before the estate's grand entrance, wheels sinking slightly into the wet gravel drive, the horses finally allowed to still after their long and desperate run. Servants rushed out at once with umbrellas raised high against the rain, their expressions a mixture of confusion and curiosity at the sight of their famously reclusive duke returning home with a woman and child in tow, something none of them had ever witnessed in all their years of service beneath this roof. As Margaret stepped down carefully from the carriage, shielding her daughter from the worst of the rain with the edge of her shawl, she caught sight of a figure watching silently from an upstairs window, a woman with sharp eyes and an unreadable expression carved into her features, standing perfectly still despite the movement below her. The figure disappeared behind the curtain, the very moment their gazes met, vanishing so quickly that Margaret almost believed she had imagined it entirely, a trick of the rain and the fading light. Margaret felt a chill run through her that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through her thin shawl, a quiet warning settling deep in her chest that this house, however grand and however safe it seemed on the surface, held secrets she had not yet begun to understand. Secrets that would soon demand far more courage from her than simply surviving an auction ever had. The morning after her arrival, Margaret woke inside a chamber larger than any room she had ever slept in, its walls draped in soft curtains, a fire still glowing faintly in the hearth from the night before. Her daughter slept peacefully in a small cradle placed beside the bed, a cradle that had clearly been fetched and prepared in haste, though no detail had been overlooked, from the folded blankets to the small carved rattle left resting nearby. Margaret sat up slowly, still uncertain whether the events of the previous day had truly happened, or whether exhaustion and fear had conjured the entire memory in her sleep. A knock came at the door before she could gather her thoughts fully. A young maid entered, carrying a tray of bread, fruit, and tea, her eyes darting nervously toward Margaret, as though unsure how to address a woman who had arrived under such strange and sudden circumstances. "His Grace requests your presence in the drawing-room, when you are ready," the maid said, setting the tray down carefully on the small table near the window. "There is no hurry. He said you should eat first, and rest if you needed." Margaret thanked her quietly, though her mind remained fixed on the figure she had glimpsed watching from the upstairs window the night before, a memory that refused to loosen its grip on her thoughts. "Might I ask," she said, before the maid could slip away, "who else resides in this house, besides His Grace?" The maid hesitated, glancing toward the door as though checking for anyone listening in the corridor beyond. "Lady Beatrice Farrow, His Grace's cousin. She has lived here since her own husband passed, some years back now. She manages much of the household affairs, the accounts, the staff, matters of that sort." Something in the maid's tone told Margaret there was more beneath the surface of that explanation, some tension left carefully unspoken, but she did not press further, sensing the girl's discomfort growing with every passing second. She finished her tea slowly, dressed in a simple gown left folded for her use, and made her way down the wide staircase toward the drawing-room where the Duke waited. Barnaby stood near the window when she entered, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, watching the last of the rain finally ease outside across the gardens. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, offering a small nod of greeting, his expression softer than she remembered from the auction square. "I trust you slept well," he said. "As well as anyone might, waking up somewhere so unfamiliar," Margaret replied honestly, folding her hands together to keep them from trembling. "I wish to ask you something, Your Grace, if you would permit it. Ask freely. You need not measure your words carefully within these walls. Your cousin, Lady Beatrice. I saw her watching us arrive last night from the upstairs window. She did not seem pleased by what she saw." Barnaby's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his features before he composed himself once more. "Beatrice has lived under this roof for many years, since long before I inherited the title. She has certain expectations about how this household should be run, and about who ought to occupy space within it. Your arrival will not please her, I imagine, though that need not concern you directly." Before Margaret could respond, the doors to the drawing-room opened without warning, and the woman from the window stepped inside, her posture rigid, her expression carefully arranged into something resembling politeness, though her eyes carried a different story altogether. "Cousin," she said, addressing Barnaby first, her voice smooth as silk pulled taut across a frame. "I heard you returned yesterday with guests." Her gaze shifted toward Margaret, sweeping over her slowly, taking in every detail of her borrowed gown. "A widow, I am told, rescued from an auction block in front of half the town. How very charitable of you, cousin. Quite the spectacle it must have made." "Margaret Thornbury," Barnaby said, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument or further commentary. "She and her daughter will be staying here, under my protection, for as long as they require it." Beatrice's smile did not waver, though something behind her eyes hardened considerably at his words. "How generous of you. Though I must wonder, cousin, what the neighboring families will say when word spreads that you have filled this house with strangers, plucked from a debtor's auction. Our family name carries certain expectations, does it not? Certain standards we have upheld for generations." Our family name, Barnaby replied evenly, his voice betraying no hesitation, has survived far worse than a little gossip among idle neighbours. I trust you will treat Mrs. Thornbury with the same respect owed to any guest beneath this roof, Beatrice. Beatrice inclined her head slightly, though the gesture felt more like a quiet warning than genuine agreement. Of course, cousin. I would never dream of doing otherwise. You know that well enough. She turned and left the room as quickly as she had entered, her skirts sweeping sharply against the polished floor, the sound echoing faintly down the corridor long after she had gone. Margaret watched her go, a knot tightening slowly in her stomach. She does not want us here, she said quietly, once the heavy door had clicked shut. No, Barnaby admitted, exhaling slowly. She does not. But this is my house, and mine alone to govern. You need not fear her presence beneath this roof. Margaret wished she could believe him entirely, but something in the sharpness of Beatrice's departing glance told her this was only the beginning of a struggle far larger than she yet understood, one that had little to do with charity, and everything to do with power. Days passed quietly, and Margaret slowly began to settle into the rhythms of the estate, though she remained cautious, ever aware of Beatrice's watchful presence lingering in corridors and doorways wherever she walked. The Duke, for his part, remained courteous but distant, checking on her welfare each evening without fail, ensuring she and her daughter lacked for nothing, though he rarely lingered long in conversation, as though something quiet and unspoken held him carefully at arm's length from drawing any closer than necessity demanded. It was on the 5th evening that Margaret overheard a conversation she was never meant to hear at all. Passing by the study on her way toward the nursery, candle in hand, she caught the low murmur of Beatrice's voice through the partly open door, urgent and hushed, speaking to someone Margaret did not recognize by sound alone. The debt was never truly Thornbury's to begin with, Beatrice was saying, her words clipped and deliberate. It was manufactured, carefully, over many months, to ensure she would have nowhere else left to turn once the truth came looking for her. I did not expect him to intervene so directly at that auction, but it changed nothing in the end. She will not last long in this house, once certain matters finally come to light. A man's voice, low and unfamiliar to Margaret's ears, replied with words she could not fully make out through the heavy door, though she caught the name Grundy mentioned twice in quick succession, along with something about papers, signatures, and a deadline still fast approaching. Margaret's blood ran cold in her veins. She stepped back from the door slowly, careful not to let her footsteps betray her presence, her heart pounding, loud enough that she feared it might echo down the empty corridor. She made her way to the nursery in silence, cradling the heavy weight of what she had just overheard, uncertain what to do with knowledge that felt far too dangerous to carry alone. That night, Margaret lay awake long after her daughter had finally fallen asleep, turning over the fragments of conversation she had overheard again and again in her mind, searching for some explanation that made sense of it all. The debt had been manufactured. Someone had deliberately orchestrated her husband's ruin, and by extension, her own suffering, all to force her into a position where she would have no choice but to be sold at auction like property. But why? What purpose could it possibly serve for Beatrice to see her humiliated and cast out into the streets with nothing but a hungry infant to her name? Unless, Margaret realized slowly, with a growing sense of dread settling deep into her chest, the true target of this scheme had never truly been her at all. The following morning, she sought out Barnaby before he could disappear once again into his usual round of estate business and correspondence. She found him in his study, papers scattered across the wide desk before him, his expression tired in a way she had not yet seen since her arrival. "Your Grace," she said, closing the heavy door behind her carefully. I must tell you something I overheard last night, though I fear you may not welcome hearing it. He looked up at once, setting down his pen without hesitation. Speak freely, Margaret. You need not fear my reaction, whatever it is you have to say. She recounted the conversation as best she could remember it, word for careful word, watching his expression darken steadily with each detail she offered. When she finished, he sat back slowly in his chair, running a weary hand across his face, the weight of sudden realization settling visibly across his shoulders. Grundy, he said quietly, almost to himself, as though testing the name aloud for the first time in years. My late father's solicitor, retained for decades before his passing. I had wondered why certain documents regarding the estate's finances seemed subtly altered these past months. I had assumed it was mere carelessness, an aging man's error. Nothing more sinister than that. You believe Lady Beatrice orchestrated my husband's ruin deliberately? Margaret asked, though she already suspected the answer waiting behind his silence. I believe, Barnaby said slowly, choosing each word with care, that Beatrice has spent years quietly resenting the fact that this estate did not pass to her upon my father's death, despite her firm belief that her own claim through marriage should have carried greater weight. She has remained here ever since, waiting patiently for some opportunity to secure her position permanently, perhaps through marriage to me, perhaps through other means I have not yet fully uncovered. But what could my husband's debt possibly have to do with her ambitions? Margaret pressed, leaning forward. I was nothing to her before yesterday. I was nothing to anyone before you arrived at that auction and changed everything. Barnaby was quiet for a long moment before answering, his gaze distant, turned toward memories Margaret could not see. Your husband, Thomas Thornbury. Did he ever mention working as a clerk for my father's estate, some years before his passing, perhaps before you were even married to him? Margaret's breath caught sharply in her throat. He did mention such work, briefly, though he never spoke of it in any real detail. He said only that he had left the position under difficult circumstances he preferred not to discuss. I believe, Barnaby said carefully, watching her face for reaction, that your husband may have discovered something during his time here, something Beatrice could not afford to let become known to my father or to anyone else. If he kept records of what he found, or knew something that threatened her position within this family, then ensuring his ruin, and yours by extension, would have served her purposes exceedingly well. The revelation settled over Margaret like a physical weight pressing down against her chest. Her husband's death, the debts that followed so swiftly, the auction itself in the middle of that muddy square, all of it may have been engineered from the very beginning by the same woman now living beneath the same roof as her sleeping daughter. We must find proof, Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt inside. If Thomas kept any records of what he knew, they may still exist somewhere among what little we had left. I will have my most trusted men search through what remains of your husband's belongings without delay, Barnaby said. In the meantime, you must be careful, Margaret. If Beatrice suspects for even a moment that you know anything of this, she will not hesitate to act against you directly and swiftly. That evening, as Margaret walked the long corridor toward the nursery, candle in hand, she found Beatrice waiting near the door, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes carried a sharpness Margaret had come to recognize as distinctly dangerous. You seem to be settling in quite comfortably, Beatrice said, her tone light despite the tension coiled visibly beneath it. One might almost think you intended to remain here permanently, Mrs. Thornbury. I intend to remain as long as His Grace permits it, Margaret replied carefully, refusing to let her voice waver under the weight of Beatrice's stare. Beatrice's smile thinned considerably. How fortunate for you, then, that he possesses such a generous heart, wide enough to shelter strangers from the street. Through generosity, Mrs. Thornbury has a curious way of running thin once the truth of a person's circumstances finally comes to light. I would be careful, if I were in your position, about how deeply you allow yourself to settle into a life that was never truly meant for you to keep. She swept past Margaret without waiting for any reply, leaving behind only the faint scent of lavender and the unmistakable sense that a quiet war had begun between them. One Margaret had never chosen for herself, but could no longer afford to ignore or walk away from. 3 days passed before word came from the men Barnaby had sent to search through what remained of Thomas Thornbury's belongings, stored away in a small parish storehouse since the sale of Margaret's cottage. Margaret waited in the drawing room when Barnaby finally returned, a wooden box tucked beneath his arm, his expression unreadable as he set it down upon the table between them. They found this hidden beneath a false bottom in an old trunk, he said. Your husband was careful. Whatever he knew, he did not want it discovered easily. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a bundle of papers, yellowed and creased from years of folding, along with a small leather journal bearing Thomas's familiar handwriting across its cover. She opened the journal slowly, her eyes scanning lines she had never known existed, words her husband had written in secret long before his death. The entries detailed years of quiet observation, records of household accounts Thomas had managed during his time as clerk, discrepancies he had noticed between what Beatrice reported to the late Duke and what actually existed in the ledgers, sums of money redirected through accounts bearing false names, land agreements altered slightly in her favor, granting her control over properties that should have passed directly to Barnaby upon his father's death. Thomas had documented everything meticulously, dates, figures, witnesses who might still be alive to confirm what he had seen. He knew, Margaret whispered, her voice trembling. He knew what she was doing, and he kept quiet about it. For years. Not entirely quiet, Barnaby said, lifting one of the loose papers from the box. This letter is addressed to my father, dated only weeks before Thomas left his position. He must have confronted Beatrice, or attempted to warn my father of what he had found. Margaret read the letter carefully. Thomas had written of his discoveries plainly, urging the old Duke to review the estate's finances personally, warning that certain arrangements had been altered without proper authority. The letter, judging by its condition, had never been sent. Something had stopped him. She must have discovered his intentions before he could deliver it, Margaret said slowly, piecing together years of silence and sudden misfortune. That would explain why he left his position so abruptly, and why our circumstances grew difficult so quickly afterward, debts appearing where none had existed before, opportunities closing one after another, without explanation. And when he died, Barnaby continued grimly, she saw an opportunity to finish what she had started years ago, to remove you and any lingering trace of what your husband once knew, permanently and without suspicion, falling upon her. Margaret closed the journal slowly, her grief for Thomas mixing now with a fierce and unfamiliar anger. He had tried to do right by this family, and it had cost him everything, and nearly cost her and their daughter their lives as well. We must confront her, Margaret said, before she suspects we have found this. It will not be simple, Barnaby warned, Beatrice has spent years building alliances within this household and beyond it. Grundy is not the only man she has entangled in her schemes. If we move carelessly, she may destroy this evidence before we can present it properly, or worse, turn accusations against us instead. That evening, Barnaby called for a quiet gathering in the study, inviting only his most trusted steward and the family solicitor, a stern but fair man named Percy Wickham, who had served the estate honestly for many years. Margaret sat beside Barnaby as the documents were laid out upon the desk, watching Wickham's expression shift from confusion to grave concern as he examined each page. "This is damning, Your Grace," Wickham said finally, setting down the last of the papers. "If these figures are accurate, and I have no reason to doubt Thornbury's diligence, then Lady Beatrice has systematically diverted funds from this estate for well over a decade. This goes beyond mere family disagreement. This borders on outright theft, and possibly worse, given what appears to have happened afterward to the man who discovered it. Can it be proven in a manner that would satisfy a court? Should it come to that?" Barnaby asked. "With Grundy's cooperation, certainly," Wickham replied, "though I doubt he will offer such cooperation willingly. Men who assist in schemes like these rarely confess without pressure applied firmly." "Then we shall apply it," Barnaby said, his voice hard with resolve Margaret had not yet heard from him. "Tomorrow we confront Beatrice directly, before she has any further opportunity to cover her tracks or flee this estate entirely." Margaret barely slept that night, her mind turning over every possibility, every danger that confronting Beatrice might invite. She thought of her daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, unaware of the storm gathering around the walls that sheltered her, and resolved that whatever came next, she would not allow this house to become a place of fear for her child. Not after everything they had already survived together. Morning arrived grey and still, the kind of quiet that seemed to hold its breath before a storm. Barnaby summoned Beatrice to the study shortly after breakfast, and Margaret watched from beside the window as Beatrice entered, her expression composed as always, though something flickered briefly across her features at the sight of the documents spread openly across the desk. "Cousin," Beatrice said carefully, her eyes moving quickly over the papers before returning to Barnaby's face. "What is the meaning of this sudden summons?" "You know precisely what this means," Barnaby said, his voice steady and cold. "Thomas Thornbury's records, every altered ledger, every diverted sum, every falsified agreement you arranged over the years while my father trusted you completely with the management of this family's affairs." Beatrice's composure cracked, just slightly, at the mention of the name. "I do not know what you imagine you have found, but whatever nonsense a disgraced clerk scribbled in some forgotten journal hardly constitutes proof of anything." "It constitutes enough," Wickham interjected calmly, "to warrant a full investigation into this estate's finances over the past decade, Lady Beatrice, along with a formal inquiry into the circumstances surrounding Thomas Thornbury's sudden dismissal and the debts that followed his family so swiftly afterward." Beatrice's gaze shifted toward Margaret, sharp and venomous. "So this is your doing? You came into this house barely a week ago, and already you seek to destroy the only family I have left." "You destroyed my family first," Margaret said quietly, though her voice carried steadily across the room. "You took my husband's good name, then his position, then his peace of mind, and finally you took the roof over my daughter's head. I have destroyed nothing that was not already broken by your own hand." For a long moment, Beatrice said nothing, her eyes darting between Barnaby, Wickham, and the documents laid bare across the desk, searching perhaps for some escape that did not exist within that room. "I did what was necessary," Beatrice finally said, her voice low and bitter, stripped now of its earlier smoothness. This family owed me far more than a distant corner of some estate to manage, while the true inheritance passed to a cousin who barely acknowledged my existence for years. I gave everything to this household, my youth, my marriage, my very identity, and I was to be left with nothing once your father passed, and you assumed his title. "That does not excuse what you did to an innocent family," Barnaby said. "Thomas Thornberry tried to warn my father honestly. You destroyed him for it, and nearly destroyed his widow and child as well, simply to protect secrets that should never have existed in the first place." "He should have kept silent," Beatrice snapped, though her voice wavered now with something closer to desperation than anger. None of this needed to happen if he had simply minded his own position and said nothing. "And yet he did not," Margaret said firmly, "because unlike you, he believed some things mattered more than personal gain." Beatrice's shoulders sagged slightly, the fight draining from her posture as she seemed to finally understand the position she now occupied, cornered by evidence she could no longer deny or explain away. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the floor rather than on any of them directly. "Grundy will be questioned," Wickham said. "Given the extent of what we have uncovered, I suspect he will cooperate readily once he understands the alternative facing him. As for you, Lady Beatrice, that decision rests with his grace." Barnaby was quiet for a long moment, studying his cousin with an expression caught somewhere between old affection and newly discovered betrayal. "I will not see you imprisoned, Beatrice, despite everything you have done. Whatever bitterness drove you to this, you remain family, and I will not forget that entirely. But you cannot remain in this house, not after what has come to light. You will leave by the end of the week, with whatever modest allowance I deem fair, and you will never again involve yourself in matters concerning this estate or anyone under its protection." Beatrice nodded slowly, offering no further argument, and left the room without another word, her earlier confidence replaced entirely by quiet defeat. In the days that followed, Grundy confessed readily once confronted with the documentation Wickham presented, confirming every detail Thomas had recorded years earlier. The falsified debts against Margaret's family were formally dismissed, her husband's name quietly restored among those who had once believed him careless or dishonest. Beatrice departed the estate as promised, taking only what belongings were rightfully hers, disappearing to a distant cottage purchased with the allowance Barnaby had granted, despite everything. With the truth finally settled and the household calm once more, Margaret found herself walking the gardens one afternoon, with her daughter resting against her shoulder, the sun finally breaking through weeks of grey clouds that had hung heavy over the estate since her arrival. Barnaby found her there, standing quietly at a distance before approaching. "You seem lighter today," he observed, falling into step beside her along the gravel path. "I feel lighter," Margaret admitted. "For the first time since Thomas died. I do not feel as though danger waits around every corner. I have you to thank for that, more than words can properly express." "You owe me nothing," Barnaby said. "If anything, I owe you gratitude for helping uncover a truth that had poisoned this family for years without my knowledge. Had you not overheard that conversation, had you not trusted me enough to share it, Beatrice's schemes might have continued indefinitely." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the soft crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the occasional stirring of Margaret's daughter against her shoulder. Finally, Barnaby spoke again, his voice carrying a hesitance she had not heard from him before. "Margaret, I must ask you something, and I hope you will forgive the directness of it. When I brought you here, it was only to save you from that platform, nothing more. But in the weeks since, I find myself considering a future here that extends well beyond simple charity. Margaret's heart quickened, though she kept her expression steady, uncertain where his words might lead. "What are you asking, Your Grace?" "I am asking whether you might consider remaining here permanently, not as a guest under my protection, but as my wife, if such an arrangement would ever suit you. I understand this is sudden, and I do not expect an answer immediately, but I didn't wish to leave the question unspoken any longer." Margaret stopped walking, turning to face him fully, searching his expression for any sign of obligation or pity rather than genuine feeling. She found none. Only quiet sincerity, the same steady resolve she had witnessed on the auction platform weeks earlier, when he had stepped forward without hesitation to change the course of her life entirely. "I did not expect to feel anything again after Thomas," she said slowly, honestly. "Grief has a way of convincing you that joy belongs to some other version of your life, one you no longer have access to. But these past weeks, watching you with my daughter, watching you fight for the truth, even when it meant confronting your own family, I find myself hoping for a future I had long since given up believing in." "Is that a yes, then?" Barnaby asked, the faintest smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "It is a yes," Margaret said, smiling for what felt like the first time in months, warmth spreading through her chest at the certainty of her own answer. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the estate and beyond, met with far greater warmth than Beatrice's cold predictions had suggested. The tenants who had once whispered about a duke's strange charity now spoke, instead of a love story born from tragedy and courage, of a widow rescued from despair who had found not only safety, but genuine happiness within walls that had once felt so foreign to her. Margaret's daughter grew within those walls, surrounded by warmth and security, never once aware of how close she had come to a life defined by hardship and fear. Thomas's name was restored fully among those who had known him, his integrity honored quietly, through the very truth he had died trying to protect, even if he never lived to see it vindicated. As for Barnaby, the reclusive duke once known only through distant rumor, he found in Margaret not simply a wife, but a partner who understood the weight of loss and the courage required to rebuild afterward. Together, they faced whatever challenges remained with a steadiness neither had possessed alone, bound not by circumstance or obligation, but by a choice made freely in a garden touched finally by sunlight after weeks of unrelenting rain.